DJ referred to him as his brother, even though they're not actually related.
They grew up together in West Hartford, went to Hall High School.
You find one, you find the other. I observed a tan Honda Accord parked, the doors open.
You could see blood where their victims were in the front seats when they were shot.
He never saw the shooter. He claims that he didn't know who shot them.
Alarm bells are going off in their head. This might be a retaliation.
There was one young man who really had this expectation of himself to do what was right and avenge the death of his good friend.
That's when everything went wrong.
Christmas in the capital city of Hartford, Connecticut.
It's a historic city. It's a city that used to be the richest in the U.S. There is a lot of diversity here. It's rich with culture, the arts.
Hartford is a super diverse community. You have many Latinos, Puerto Ricans, South American, Central American. You have Bosnians. You have a large Albanian community. It's just African American, Asians, Laotians, you name it, we have it in Hartford.
Saturday, December 20th, 2014. Around 5:30 in the morning, a resident of the apartment building near Colt Park is startled by a loud noise.
She sees a man. He's clutching his arm. The person is bleeding profusely. He's obviously in a lot of pain. He gets inside that building and he collapses on the stairwell.
She let him use her cell phone to call 911.
She stays with the man until EMTs and officers with the Hartford Police Department arrive.
That's where he started getting medical treatment by EMS.
He is shot in the shoulder and through the elbow.
Did they know the shooter? He did not want to say who shot him. He did not want to say anything.
Responding officers learned the man's name.
Dedrick Jimenez. DJ is his nickname.
24-year-old DJ says he was shot not far from the apartment building.
He was in his brother's car when he was shot.
DJ reveals that his brother, 23-year-old Hiram Martinez, is still in the car, and he was also shot.
His brother's car is down the street. You can almost see where the vehicle was from where he was.
Investigators find a man slumped over the center console. They can see pretty quickly he's been shot at the back of the head.
Despite the wound, Hiram still has a pulse.
He is transported to the hospital. They're still working on him.
DJ Jimenez and Hiram Martinez weren't born brothers, but came to think of each other as such by way of an intense friendship that began when they were young.
They grew up together in West Hartford, went to Hall High School. People think, well, Hartford, West Hartford, same thing, but very, very different. West Hartford has a smaller town, yet urban feel to it.
DJ referred to him as his brother. He'd call Hiram his brother, even though they're not actually related, they were just close friends.
They had a fast friendship and an enduring one. They went through a lot of life together, from their boyhood to their teen years to their adult years.
As a teen, Hiram dreamed of becoming a race car mechanic. But that dream didn't pan out. When he was 20, Hiram and his girlfriend became parents to a baby girl. On December 20th, 2014, both Hiram and DJ are on their way to Hartford Hospital after suffering gunshot wounds during an early morning attack. As the men receive medical care, detectives arrive at the apartment building near the 100-acre Colt Park.
It's an area that's usually full of happy times and families and sporting events. But on this occasion, on this day, police tape is surrounding the scene.
I was asked to respond to the crime scene and assume the role as the lead investigator.
Along with Detective Richter, siblings Anthony and Mike Rakowski are also on the case.
My brother is my twin, so to be able to work with him on such, high responsibility cases it's really an amazing thing. He brings a certain view to the table, a little bit different than mine sometimes, and we bounce back and forth off each other, and it makes for a much more well-rounded investigation.
Detectives begin their investigation in the stairwell where DJ took refuge.
We're trying to get as much information as possible as quickly as we can. So just went over there, saw what was there, which is a little blood and, some EMS equipment that they used to treat him, and then just backtracked. So I just started walking from there back towards the vehicle.
They examine the car, where the second victim, Hiram, was found.
I observed the doors open, 2 doors open.
You could see blood. You could see kind of where the victims were in the front seats when they were shot.
Hiram Martinez had been seated in the front passenger seat, and DJ was the operator of the vehicle.
That leads investigators to an important conclusion about where the shots came from.
So Hiram shot in the back of the head, and then Dedrick is shot in the shoulder and through the elbow. And if you imagine a Honda Accord, with a center console and the driver sitting in the driver position, that's consistent with being shot from the back seat. The shooter's in the back seat.
It appears likely to investigators that DJ and Hiram knew the person who shot them.
We didn't really find any shell casings outside the car. I think we maybe found a cigarette butt outside the car. We don't know if that was connected.
Investigators will have to wait for a warrant to conduct a detailed search of the vehicle. With the crime scene giving up few clues, detectives head to Hartford Hospital to speak with the victims.
They have to start figuring out why. What's the motive? Why did someone want to hurt or potentially kill both of these men? They go to the hospital. That's where DJ has had successful surgery on his shoulder and elbow. He's got permanent rods put in both.
Detectives learn that the man DJ called his brother is not so lucky.
Hiram Martinez, he died later at the hospital. We had a homicide.
Detectives speak with DJ, who is still claiming to know nothing about the attack.
We're trying to get as much information as possible as quickly as we can. He gave us bits and pieces.
The initial information he provided was, I don't want to say misleading, but it was not complete. He initially provides information that he never saw the shooter. He claims that he didn't know who shot them, that he was in a vehicle. He took off running.
Witnesses don't want to be witnesses. People are scared. They don't want to be the one that snitches.
No one wants to be, considered a snitch.
Investigators share with DJ that his beloved brother and best friend, Hiram, has died.
When he finds out that Hiram Martinez, his childhood best friend, is dead, that's when everything changed.
He started giving information about who the person was.
Now that DJ's willing to talk, investigators are all ears. And it turns out DJ has a lot to say.
The individual who shot them goes by the street name Apollo.
In Hartford, Connecticut, police are investigating an early morning double shooting just days before Christmas in 2014. 24-year-old DJ Jimenez survived wounds to the shoulder and arm. His best friend, 23-year-old Hiram Martinez, was not as fortunate.
He's been shot at the back of the head, and he is pronounced dead.
After learning of his best friend's death, DJ cooperates with detectives. He says he knows who fired the shots.
That was when DJ provided the information that an individual he knows as Papone was the person who shot him.
It was someone he met during a stint in prison. Both were on parole.
DJ tells detectives he and Hiram ran into Papone the night before.
DJ says that he was out with his bro. They were hanging, having some drinks, going to some clubs.
And he had explained that they had all been at an after-hours party off of Park Street in Hartford. And he and Hiram had had contact with Papone at that party.
So there's DJ, Papone, and Hiram all hanging out. They're having drinks. It's a good time. It's really late at night, early in the morning, and it seems all good. At one point, DJ has to use the restroom. And that's when Hiram and Papone have time together themselves.
DJ tells detectives that when he came back, Papone's mood was starkly different.
His whole disposition changed. He wasn't talkative anymore. He knew something was wrong or something was off with this guy.
Everything seemed to be fine, but now something has changed drastically. He explains to investigators something wasn't right. He didn't know what at the time.
According to DJ, Hiram pulled him aside a few moments later. He claimed that Papone became upset when Hiram started talking about another crime, one that took place about a week prior.
Hiram had actually somewhat bragged at the fact that he had killed Mariano Gonzalez on Bond Street to Papone.
Investigators interviewing DJ immediately recognized the crime DJ is referring to.
When they're hearing DJ say this, now alarm bells are going off in their head. We might have a payback. This might be a retaliation.
My brother was assigned as the lead investigator in that case. I was called in to assist.
December 14th, 2014, we had patrol officers dispatched to the area. It was about almost 2 a.m. on the report of shots fired and then another call of a person shot. Officers went out to the scene. At that time, they located a victim with a gunshot wound to the head. He was pronounced deceased on scene.
The victim was 37-year-old Mariano Gonzalez.
This crime scene was fairly limited in size in the sense that it was contained to really the driveway and the street immediately in front of there. There wasn't too much for evidence at that scene other than the deceased himself. Once the initial photographs are done, and then we can kind of roll the deceased over to get a better look at him, we discovered that he had a cell phone in his pocket and he had ammunition, rifle caliber ammunition.
When investigators questioned onlookers at the scene, they learned that one woman witnessed the actual shooting.
She heard an argument outside. She heard some foul language, caused her to look out the window, and she sees the suspect shoot our victim one time. The victim falls. She sees him shoot a second time. After he shot a second time, the suspect goes through, by her account, goes through the victim's pockets. She believed he took a watch off of his wrist. As the suspect stood up, he then kicked the victim in the face and then ran away. She described him as thin, right? Very thin. He was shorter than the victim.
When detectives broke the news of Mariano's death to his family, they hoped they might also uncover a lead.
It's a huge priority for us to open up that line of communication with family and implore them to actually give us information.
But instead, Mariano's brother flew into a rage.
The brother was very aggressive, like very, very aggressive. I understand he's grieving, you know, people process that differently. So we kind of let him be. The brother shut the door on us, like, we're done, we're not talking to you. So we didn't really get anywhere as far as establishing a timeline there or any cooperation with family.
The major challenge initially was the victim's family's lack of cooperation.
They didn't want anything to do with it, I guess because of the fear of retaliation. And you find out a lot of people don't want to get involved.
Eventually, investigators did gain access to Mariano's cell phone.
We were able to take one of the last phone numbers that had made contact with the victim and link that to Hiram Martinez. The contact, if I recall, was about 30 minutes prior to the calls for the shots fired.
Hiram also matched the description of the shooter given by the woman who witnessed the crime.
And now we have eyewitnesses giving us a description of a person consistent with Hiram Martinez. It's really starting to point towards Hiram Martinez. We're still far away from calling him a suspect. He's just someone that we want to talk to.
But before detectives could question Hiram, he too was gunned down. Back at Hartford Hospital, Hiram's best friend, DJ, tells investigators that Hiram bragged about shooting Mariano to the man who eventually shot both him and Hiram.
According to DJ, Hiram told Pepone that he killed Mariano.
We immediately suspected that there was a connection to the original Bond Street case.
Police in Hartford, Connecticut are investigating the shooting death of 23-year-old Hiram Martinez. They believe his death could be related to a shooting that claimed the life of Mariano Gonzalez just 6 days before. A killing that Hiram was suspected of carrying out.
Although we suspected that, we don't fixate on that because it's very easy to fixate on an avenue like that and then you overlook a second potential suspect. We've seen commonly that people have multiple adversaries and multiple avenues of people that want to harm them. So, though we believed it wholeheartedly, we had to remain open-minded.
So far, the only person investigators can count on for information is the sole surviving victim of the second shooting, DJ Jimenez. As DJ recovers in a local hospital, detectives continue to press him for details.
He told us bits and pieces through multiple interviews. We met with Mr. Jimenez several times, different detectives, myself, to try to piece together what occurred. This happened over a course of a few interviews.
Over time, DJ expands on what happened when Pepone's mood had changed that night at the club, after Hiram had bragged about shooting Mariano.
It's getting late, and clearly the fun is starting to feel like it's over. Pepone's not in a good mood.
They were leaving, and Pepone had asked them to give him a ride to his girlfriend's house.
They didn't want to give him a ride. Eventually, reluctantly, I guess they did give him a ride.
DJ explains he was driving with Pepone in the back and Hiram in the passenger seat. Pepone said he needed some cigarettes. They stopped at a convenience store.
Pepone wants Martinez to get the cigarettes. Martinez doesn't want to get the cigarettes. The bantering and the arguing is going on. Finally, DJ says, I'll get the cigarettes. He goes into the convenience store. He comes out with the cigarettes. Now, supposedly, they're on their way.
Then Pepone requested another stop, this time so he could relieve himself. He tells DJ to pull over near Cold Park.
They pull up next to a grassy knoll on the outside of the park, and Pepone gets out. DJ tells investigators that he can see Pepone, and Pepone is not so far away, but he's on his cell phone. And he watches him on his cell phone, probably doesn't think too much of it, waits for him to get back to the car.
Shortly thereafter, he gets back in the vehicle, and that's when Jimenez hears a loud bang. covers his ears. He realizes it's a gunshot. Gets out of the car, starts running.
For investigators, it raises concern that the cycle of retaliation might continue. But that leaves them with a burning question. Who is Pepone?
Street names are street names. They could be used by anybody.
Detectives know they need to ID Pepone quickly before the bloodshed continues.
We don't want to see retaliatory violence. Anytime we have a crime of violence like this, we are very concerned about retaliation. A lot of times we see family members or close friends of victims, if they hear a name, whether it's true or not, they want to go retaliate.
Investigators aren't the only ones who are worried.
This was a crime 5 days before Christmas. The crime on Bond Street was just a week prior. This was something that really rocked the Hartford community. This was yet another homicide in a city reeling from way more than their fair share. This was something that people who lived in the area were stunned by. They were startled, they were shaken, they were scared.
Detectives hunker down, focused on finding Pepone's true identity.
We will take those street names and we'll enter them into certain databases that we have, or we ask, DOC contacts, probation contacts, anybody who's familiar with somebody utilizing this street name.
We just had his nickname, and we were able to identify who he was through, our channels with the Department of Correction, because he uses that nickname, Pepone, before.
We were able to take the street name information obtained from DJ. We were able to determine that Pepone was, in fact, Tyrone Rosa.
To make sure they have the right guy, investigators show DJ a photo lineup.
We created a photo array. In that array, it contains our potential suspect as well as individuals who look similar.
It didn't take any time at all for DJ to say, that's him.
He did make a positive ID of Tyrone Rosa as being the person that was in the car.
In Hartford, Connecticut, detectives believe they're getting closer to finding the killer of Hiram Martinez, after Hiram's best friend, DJ, identifies Tyrone Rosa as the gunman.
After we identified Pepone, or Tyrone Rosa, we just started doing a workup, a background on him to figure out where he lives, all this pertinent information.
Before they attempt to bring him in for questioning, detectives do some digging on Tyrone. They learn he was close with the murder victim, Mariano Gonzalez, and his brother, the man who'd flown into a rage in front of police upon learning of Mariano's death.
He knew Mariano, but the relationship that Pepone had with his brother was far deeper than investigators first realized. They found out later, via social media, that this was someone that Pepone cared deeply about. He said he loved him, he would die for him.
But investigators speculate that Hiram had no idea the man he was socializing with at the club was so close to a man he claimed to have killed.
Tyrone and Mariano Gonzalez's brother and Mariano Gonzalez were actually friends. We don't believe that Hiram knew that when he was bragging about that homicide.
Tyrone may have wanted to retaliate because Hiram Martinez admitted to killing the brother of one of his closest friends.
Investigators also learned that the 35-year-old Tyrone Rosa is no stranger to the law.
He was on parole, which is great for us because that gives us access for an interview. And that's what we did. We ended up having his parole officer bring him up to the Major Crimes Division for an interview.
17 days after Hiram and DJ were shot, Tyrone Rosa is brought in for questioning with detectives, grudgingly.
He didn't seem nervous, per se. He definitely seemed very closed off and reluctant to speak. He was keeping his cards close to his chest.
Detectives keep at it.
We started getting to the meat of it, asking him if he knew certain people, if he was at an after-hours club with them. He, seemed reluctant to speak, but then he started giving us some information, saying he was at an after-hours club with Mr. Martinez and Mr. Jimenez.
At this point, the story is starting to line up a little bit with DJ's, but this is where the story changes.
Tyrone claims he didn't leave the club with DJ and Hiram.
He said he never went with them in the vehicle, that he stayed at the after-hours club, and they left by themselves. When I knew he was lying, that's a good sign, actually, for me. I like when people lie in an interview. You know you're getting close.
As for the victim of the first shooting, Mariano Gonzalez, Tyrone says he had no reason to avenge that death.
He said that he doesn't really know the other victim, which was Mr. Gonzalez, and his brother, kind of downplayed it. Said he knew of them, didn't really associate with them. He kept trying to downplay his association with the victim.
Investigators aren't buying it.
He didn't really want to admit that he was really close friends with him. We knew he was close friends with his brother. That's our belief of why this occurred.
Speculation isn't enough to bring murder charges, but investigators do find a way to keep Tyrone behind bars.
Because Mr. Rosa was on parole at the time, and he was a suspect in a homicide, his parole was violated, so he's remanded to custody.
Investigators keep close tabs on Tyrone. The day after his arrest, he makes a phone call from jail to Mariano's brother.
We already said he wasn't close to him, so why are you calling this guy if you don't really associate with him? So that, obviously, we knew he was lying.
That's not all. He asked Mariano's brother for a favor.
He also started telling this guy to destroy his phone, which is like, if you have no involvement in it, why are you telling someone to destroy their phones?
In late December 2014, police in Hartford, Connecticut are holding Tyrone Rosa in connection with the shooting death of 23-year-old Hiram Martinez. Detectives believe that Tyrone killed Hiram in retaliation for the death of his friend, Mariano Gonzalez.
He denied shooting Mr. Jimenez or Mr. Martinez. He said, I never went with them to the car.
But the day after Tyrone is taken into custody, he makes a jailhouse phone call to Mariano's brother, requesting that he tell a man named CL to destroy his phone. Investigators want to know why. They track down CL.
He was on probation for a gun arrest, so we interviewed him at his probation office.
CL admits he was with Tyrone that night.
He's friends with Tyrone Rosa, and he was with Mr. Rosa at the After Hours Club prior to the incident.
Eventually, Tyrone left the club.
He just went, didn't know where he went. Mr. Rosa didn't tell him.
Then, around 5:30 a.m., minutes after the shooting would have taken place, CL called Tyrone to ask him where he had gone. Tyrone didn't say, but asked CL to pick him up at a location near Colt Park.
He went and picked him up near the crime scene. I don't even think he knew what Mr. Rosa did, because I asked him all that, and he just picked him up and was doing him a favor.
CL's statement appears to contradict what Tyrone told detectives.
Mr. Rosa denied, obviously, being in that car, so if you weren't in that car, you're not being picked up by the crime scene. We found the guy who picked him up by the crime scene.
In order to charge Tyrone with murder, investigators need more. They need evidence. They hope the vehicle in which Hiram and DJ were shot might give them just that.
We obtain a search warrant to process that car. The crime scene division will process it, and they'll look for all different kinds of physical evidence: DNA, fingerprints, shell casings, firearms, anything that's in there that we ask them to look for. They found a fingerprint on the inside rear door handle, which it's actually pretty rare to get a usable fingerprint. But they did recover a fingerprint, and that print later did hit to Tyrone Rosa.
Now they know what he told them about not being anywhere near the crime scene, not still being in the car, was not true. They placed Tyrone at the scene of the murder.
Though it doesn't prove he pulled the trigger, the fingerprint is the final piece of evidence investigators need to bring Tyrone Rosa one important step closer to justice.
With that positive ID, with the physical evidence to support it, that was enough.
At this point, the lead investigator will take all this information and compile it into an arrest warrant, and that's exactly what he did.
On February 18, 2015, nearly 2 months after Hiram Martinez and DJ Jimenez were shot, Tyrone Rosa is charged with murder, first-degree assault, and criminal gun possession.
Mr. Rosa was arrested for the murder of one gentleman, assault on another gentleman.
He was already remanded to custody because he was on parole, so he's in jail already.
But will prosecutors be able to keep him there?
Throughout the court proceedings, he maintained his innocence. He said, "Someone killed him, but it wasn't me."
On February 2nd, 2015, in Hartford Superior Court, Tyrone Rosa goes on trial for the murder of Hiram Martinez and the assault of DJ Jimenez. In court, Tyrone is stoic.
He was very calm and didn't seem nervous or excited. He's kind of a low energy type of guy.
Prosecutors argue that Tyrone was out for revenge after Hiram told him that he killed Mariano Gonzalez.
The claim was that Mr. Rosa had killed this one gentleman for revenge for a friend of his that had been killed. My client gave a very different version. There was this unknown third person who my client says put a gun to his head and presumably committed the shooting.
There was one young man who really had this expectation of himself to do what was right or what was considered the admirable thing to do and avenge the death of his good friend, his friend's brother. There's no alternative other than to take the same lethal action that was used against the person that you loved.
DJ takes the stand as the state's star witness. He walks the jury through details of Mariano's murder, according to what Hiram told him.
Hiram met up with Mariano Gonzalez on Bond Street in Hartford. He was supposed to buy a gun. DJ says, changed his mind. Now Hiram doesn't want to buy the gun. Mariano was basically set on selling this gun. You're buying this gun. And that's when everything went wrong.
Mariano Gonzalez had actually threatened Hiram Martinez's family.
Hiram has a 3-year-old child and a significant other that clearly he cared about very much. So when someone threatened to wipe out his family, this did not sit the right way. DJ says that's when Hiram told him that he killed Mariano Gonzalez in cold blood.
A week later at the club, when Tyrone Rosa learned that Hiram killed Mariano, Tyrone then set his sights on Hiram. On the stand, DJ recalls the chilling moment that claimed his best friend's life.
Tyrone got out to use the bathroom. They didn't think anything of that, and as he got back in the car, DJ claims he heard a loud bang, covered his ears, realized it was a shooting, got out and ran. At that point, he realized he had been shot as well.
As the defense gets underway, Tyrone Rosa takes the stand.
He admitted to lying to police, and the reason why he lied was because he was on parole and didn't want his parole remanded.
Tyrone admits he did drive around with DJ and Hiram that night.
The police found my client's fingerprints in the car. My client didn't dispute having been in the car. Everybody agreed that he had been in the car. The question was he the shooter?
But Tyrone insists he was not.
There was no forensic evidence that directly tied my client to the shooting. They didn't find the murder weapon, for example. They didn't find any DNA on anything that directly linked my client to the murder. So the lack of that sort of evidence made the trial a credibility contest.
Tyrone offers up what he claims is the truth about what happened that night.
My client testified that while he was urinating, somebody came up behind him, put a gun to his head, and told him, "Don't move. This isn't about you." And then he heard a couple gunshots. Went back to the car where the deceased and Mr. Jimenez were, saw that the deceased had been shot, and took off running.
He basically denied being the person to pull the trigger, and he said it was somebody else who he couldn't identify who was responsible for the murder. He didn't provide any information as far as description or who might have been the person who did this.
Once all the testimony was heard in court, it was up to the jurors to decide this case. It didn't take them long before they came back, and on February 14th, their verdict was guilty.
At sentencing, Tyrone shows no remorse and continues to claim innocence.
And to this day, he's still saying that he's innocent.
The judge sees things differently.
He spoke of the senseless cycle of violence, the tragic nature in which a domino effect happened with these crimes that led to a payback. And Tyrone Rosa was about to pay.
Mr. Rosa was sentenced to 55 years for the murder of Mr. Martinez, and he got an additional 15 years for shooting Mr. Jimenez.
For investigators, this was a relief. They had a conviction. Tyrone Papone Rosa. But remember, there were two crimes here. The payback was preceded by the murder of Mariano Gonzalez.
There was a witness that, in fact, saw the shooter go through the victim's pockets. DNA testing was done from the victim's pockets, and the recovered DNA evidence actually came back to Hiram Martinez.
Not only did we have the story now of Hiram Martinez telling DJ that he did commit the crime in the murder of Mariano Gonzalez, but DNA evidence confirmed it.
Closed cases cannot fill the holes left by loved ones who will never return.
Even if you do arrest somebody,
there are monsters who hide in the shadows. And then there are monsters who smile. The second kind is always more dangerous. Because nobody runs from a smile. Montreal, Canada. Late autumn. The city slept beneath a blanket of cold darkness. Streetlights painted long amber reflections across wet pavement. The wind drifted through narrow streets lined with apartment buildings, carrying with it the scent of rain and chimney smoke. Inside warm apartments, televisions flickered. Couples shared late dinners. Students prepared for exams. Night shift workers buttoned their coats and stepped into the cold. Life moved forward the way it always did. Ordinary. Predictable. Safe. Or at least, that was what people believed. Because somewhere in that city, a man was walking through the darkness. He didn't look frightening. He wasn't the kind of man parents warned their daughters about. He didn't lurk in alleyways. He didn't wear a mask. He didn't carry a knife. In fact, if you passed him on the sidewalk, you probably wouldn't remember him 5 minutes later. You might notice his clothes. Clean. Stylish. Carefully chosen. You might notice his confidence. The easy way he carried himself. The relaxed smile. The calm eyes. The sort of man who seemed comfortable anywhere. The sort of man who could start a conversation with a stranger and make it feel natural. The sort of man who looked trustworthy. And that was exactly what made him deadly. Because predators evolve. They learn. They adapt. They discover that force is noisy. Fear attracts attention. But charm. Charm opens doors. Charm is invited inside. Years later, investigators would look back at the trail of violence left behind by this man and realize something terrifying. Most of his victims never expected danger. There were no broken windows. No forced entries. No signs of a stranger kicking down doors in the middle of the night. Instead, there were conversations. Introductions. Smiles. Perhaps a drink. Perhaps laughter. Moments that felt ordinary. Moments that felt harmless. Moments that ended in horror. Before the police knew his name, before newspapers created headlines, before forensic experts studied every detail of his crimes, there was only a growing sense of unease spreading through Montreal. A feeling that something was wrong. Women began checking locks twice before going to bed. Friends reminded each other to call when they arrived home. Families exchanged worried glances over dinner tables. Nobody could explain exactly why. Yet fear was beginning to settle over the city like winter fog. Because people understood something even before investigators did. A predator was hunting. And he wasn't choosing victims randomly. He was choosing trust. That made him almost invisible. The first victim did not arrive with the dramatic shock of a movie scene. Real evil rarely does. It arrived quietly. A body discovered where no body should have been. A young woman whose future had been stolen in a single night. A daughter. A friend. A person who had plans for tomorrow. Someone who never imagined she would become the opening chapter in one of Canada's most disturbing criminal cases. The discovery stunned investigators. Not only because of the violence. Not only because of the sexual assault. But because of something else. Something unusual. Something that seemed almost impossible to understand. Marks. Deep marks. Left on the victim's body. Marks that suggested a level of obsession far beyond murder itself. Experienced detectives examined photographs and exchanged uncertain looks. They had seen shootings. Stabbings. Strangulations. Domestic murders. Bar fights gone wrong. But this was different. There was something intensely personal about what they were seeing. Something disturbing. Something animalistic. As if the killer wanted more than control. More than dominance. More than death. At first, investigators hoped it was an isolated crime. A tragic exception. A terrible event that would never happen again. But monsters rarely stop after one victim. Especially when they discover they enjoy the hunt. Weeks passed. The city attempted to move on. Yet somewhere out there, the killer was still free. Still walking among ordinary people. Still smiling. Still shaking hands. Still introducing himself. Perhaps sitting across from someone in a restaurant. Perhaps sharing a joke. Perhaps planning his next move. No one knew. Because evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it wears polished shoes. Sometimes it drives a nice car. Sometimes it speaks softly. Sometimes it looks exactly like the kind of man you would trust. Then came another victim. And another. The pattern began to emerge. Young women. Sexual assault. Strangulation. The same chilling signature. The same unanswered questions. Each crime scene seemed to whisper the same message. The killer had been welcomed inside. That realization terrified investigators. A stranger forcing entry could be stopped. People could lock doors. Install better security. Avoid dangerous neighborhoods. But how do you protect yourself from someone who makes you feel safe? That question haunted the investigation. And it haunted the city. Because every new discovery brought another painful truth. The killer was patient. Disciplined. Calculated. He understood human psychology in ways that many criminals never do. He knew how to lower defenses. How to create comfort. How to disguise danger. He understood that trust can be stronger than any weapon. The newspapers eventually gave him a name. A name that would spread fear across Canada. A name that sounded like something from a nightmare. A name inspired by the bizarre wounds found on his victims. The Vampire Rapist. The headline captured public attention immediately. It was sensational. Shocking. Impossible to ignore. Yet behind the dramatic nickname was a far more frightening reality. This wasn't a supernatural creature. This wasn't a monster from folklore. This was a human being. A real man. Living among ordinary people. Breathing the same air. Walking the same streets. And every day he remained free increased the chance that another woman would die. The investigation stretched on. Detectives chased leads. Interviewed witnesses. Studied evidence. Built theories. Destroyed theories. Started over. Again and again. Sometimes they believed they were close. Sometimes they felt completely lost. Meanwhile, the killer continued moving forward with terrifying confidence. As if he believed nobody could stop him. As if he believed he was smarter than everyone hunting him. And for a while, he seemed right. Months became years. The trail of victims grew. Families buried daughters. Friends searched for answers. Investigators carried photographs home in briefcases and stared at them late into the night. Every image represented a life interrupted. Every file represented someone waiting for justice. Yet justice remained frustratingly out of reach. Then something happened. Something nobody could have predicted. The answer would not come from a dramatic confession. Not from a hidden witness. Not from a lucky break. Instead, it would emerge from one of the most unusual forms of forensic evidence ever introduced in a major murder case. Evidence so controversial that decades later experts would still debate its reliability. Evidence that would transform criminal investigations forever. A human bite. A mark left behind by arrogance. A clue hidden in plain sight. The killer had spent years believing he was untouchable. But sometimes the smallest detail becomes the loudest witness. And when investigators finally realized what they were looking at, the hunt for a predator entered its final chapter. The smiling stranger who called himself Bill had no idea that his own body was preparing to betray him. No idea that every conversation, every encounter, every carefully crafted mask was beginning to crack. No idea that the city he believed he had outsmarted was slowly closing in. Because every predator eventually makes a mistake. And when that moment comes, the darkness that once protected them begins to disappear. For Wayne Clifford Bowden, that moment was approaching. And when it arrived, it would expose not only a serial killer. It would expose a terrifying lesson about trust itself. The lesson that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is not the one who looks threatening. It's the one who makes everyone feel safe. Before the headlines. Before the fear. Before parents began worrying when their daughters came home late. There was a city. Montreal in the late 1960s was a city standing between two worlds. The optimism of the post-war era still lingered in the air, but beneath the surface, change was arriving faster than many people could comprehend. The city breathed with energy. New apartment buildings rose above older neighborhoods. Neon signs illuminated downtown streets. Cafes remained busy long after sunset. Music drifted through bars and restaurants where young people gathered to celebrate a future that seemed limitless. The world felt modern. Possibilities seemed endless. For many young women, it was a time of independence unlike anything their mothers had experienced. More women were living alone. More women were building careers. More women were choosing their own paths. Montreal reflected that transformation. A woman could rent her own apartment, work her own job, spend evenings with friends, date who she wanted, make plans for a future entirely her own. It was a city filled with movement, filled with ambition, filled with people arriving from different places in search of opportunity. Among them were teachers, students, sales clerks, secretaries, nurses, young professionals beginning adult lives. The city offered freedom. And freedom often comes with trust. Trust in strangers. Trust in neighbors. Trust that the smiling man standing beside you in an elevator was exactly who he appeared to be. Back then, the world felt smaller. Safer. People still answered doors without hesitation. Many apartment buildings left entrances unlocked during daylight hours. A friendly introduction often carried more weight than suspicion. If someone was polite, well-dressed, and spoke confidently, most people accepted them at face value. It was a different era. An era before digital records. Before security cameras watched every corner. Before social media allowed instant warnings to spread across entire communities. People relied on instinct. And instinct can be manipulated. Especially by someone who understands human behavior. Montreal's nightlife reflected the confidence of the age. Restaurants buzzed with conversation. Dance clubs filled with young couples. Friends gathered after work to escape long Canadian winters. Laughter echoed through crowded rooms illuminated by cigarette smoke and soft yellow light. A chance meeting at a bar could become a friendship. A friendship could become a romance. A romance could begin with nothing more than a smile. People wanted to believe the best about one another. Most of the time, that belief was rewarded. Sometimes, it wasn't. As the city evolved, another kind of change was occurring quietly beneath the surface. Crime itself was changing. The image of danger many people carried in their minds no longer matched reality. For decades, people imagined violent criminals as obvious threats. Rough men lurking in dark alleys. Armed robbers. Drifters with visible signs of instability. The danger felt external. Easy to recognize. Easy to avoid. But a new generation of offenders was beginning to challenge those assumptions. Some understood that appearance could become camouflage. Some discovered that intelligence could be more useful than intimidation. Some learned that trust opened far more doors than fear. And somewhere inside Montreal, one of those men was developing into something investigators would struggle to understand. Wayne Clifford Bowden did not grow up looking like the future subject of criminal investigations. Nothing about his appearance screamed danger. He possessed qualities society often associated with success. Physical attractiveness. Confidence. Charm. The ability to engage people effortlessly. Witnesses would later describe him as polished. Presentable. Sophisticated. He knew how to make an impression. He knew how to control conversations. Most importantly, he knew how to make people comfortable. Those skills may sound harmless. In most people, they are. But in the hands of a predator, they become tools. And tools can be sharpened. Long before police departments connected his name to murder files, Bowden had already learned something powerful about human nature. People rarely fear what they find attractive. They rarely question someone who appears successful. They rarely expect violence from a person who seems calm. The lesson became part of his identity. Part of the mask he wore every day. A mask that would allow him to move through society almost unnoticed. To understand why his crimes proved so difficult to solve, it is necessary to understand the atmosphere surrounding them. This was not a city preparing for a serial predator. This was not a community expecting a nightmare. Most investigators at the time had little experience dealing with serial sexual homicide. The concept itself remained unfamiliar to much of the public. Murder investigations often focused on immediate relationships, spouses, family members, business disputes, known enemies. The idea that a single offender might be selecting multiple victims across different locations remained difficult to prove. Patterns appeared slowly. Connections emerged reluctantly. Every crime initially looked isolated. Every victim seemed trapped within her own tragedy. Only later would investigators realize they were examining chapters from the same story. Meanwhile, life continued throughout the city. Snow arrived. Snow melted. Seasons changed. People fell in love. People moved into new apartments. People started new jobs. Children attended school. Families gathered for holidays. The rhythm of ordinary life remained unchanged. And perhaps that is what makes these cases so unsettling. Evil does not pause the world before it arrives. It enters quietly, while everyone else continues living. Somewhere, a woman laughs with friends. Elsewhere, a predator studies his reflection in a mirror. One person dreams about the future. Another imagines how to take it away. Those two paths move toward each other unseen. At first, nobody notices. Then suddenly, everything changes. By the beginning of the 1970s, Montreal was becoming one of Canada's most vibrant urban centers. Yet alongside prosperity came anonymity. Large cities create opportunities. They also create distance. A person can disappear into crowds, can reinvent themselves, can introduce themselves using a different name, can move through hundreds of daily interactions without attracting attention. That anonymity became one of Wayne Bowden's greatest advantages. Witnesses would later remember meeting a man named Bill. Friendly, charming, well-spoken. A man who seemed entirely ordinary. The name appeared repeatedly. Yet Bill was not who he truly was. The simplicity of that deception reveals something important about predators like Bowden. They often do not rely on elaborate schemes. They rely on small lies repeated consistently. A different name. A manufactured story. A carefully crafted image. Most people never think to question such details. Why would they? The overwhelming majority of strangers are exactly who they claim to be. Society depends on that assumption. Without it, everyday life becomes impossible. Predators exploit the trust that holds communities together. They hide inside it. Like wolves moving among sheep unnoticed. What makes the Wayne Bowden case particularly chilling is not only the violence that followed. It is the contrast between appearance and reality. The gap between the man people saw and the man who truly existed. To some, he appeared successful. To others, attractive. To others, charismatic. Yet hidden beneath that image was a growing obsession. An obsession that would eventually leave a trail of devastation stretching across provinces. As investigators would later discover, his crimes were not fueled solely by sexual violence. There was something deeper. Something darker. A need for domination. A need for control. A need that transformed intimacy into terror. But those truths remained hidden for years. In the beginning, nobody saw the full picture. Friends saw a pleasant acquaintance. Women saw a potential romantic partner. Casual observers saw another face in the crowd. No one saw the predator waiting behind the smile. And that is what made the setting so important. Because every crime story begins long before the crime itself. It begins with a world that believes it is safe. A community that trusts. A city that sleeps peacefully. A population convinced tomorrow will look much like today. Montreal believed that. Calgary believed it too. Neither city knew that a man was carrying darkness from one place to another. Neither city understood that their lives were about to become connected by violence. Neither city knew that forensic history was quietly preparing to change forever. The years between 1969 and 1971 would eventually become remembered not simply for the crimes themselves but for what they revealed about predators, investigations, and human trust. Yet at the beginning of that story, none of those lessons existed. There were only ordinary people living ordinary lives, walking ordinary streets, making ordinary plans. And somewhere among them, a man named Wayne Clifford Bowden was preparing to become one of the most infamous killers in Canadian criminal history. The city could not see him for what he was. Not yet. The nightmare was still hidden beneath the surface. Still wearing a smile. Still introducing itself as Bill. Still waiting for the moment when trust would open another door. Every investigation begins with a moment. A single moment when ordinary life collides with something unimaginable. For the families of the victims, that moment would become frozen in memory forever. For investigators, it would become the first page of a case file. For the city, it would become the beginning of a fear that few yet understood. The discovery of a crime scene is rarely dramatic in the way films portray it. There is no music. No perfect timing. No instant revelation that explains everything. Instead, there is confusion, questions, and an overwhelming realization that something is terribly wrong. In October of 1969, that realization arrived behind an apartment complex in Montreal. The weather had begun to turn colder. Summer was gone. Autumn had settled across the city, covering sidewalks with damp leaves and shortening the daylight hours. The area itself appeared ordinary. Residents moved in and out of the building every day. Children played nearby. Workers left in the mornings and returned home after dark. Nothing about the location suggested it would soon become the focus of a homicide investigation. Yet hidden behind the routine rhythms of city life was the body of 20-year-old Shirley Audette. When authorities arrived, they immediately recognized that this was not a natural death. The scene demanded answers. Detectives began documenting everything. The position of the body. The surrounding environment. The smallest details that might later reveal what had happened. Every crime scene is a conversation between victim and investigator. The victim cannot speak. The evidence speaks instead. And on that day, the evidence revealed only fragments. Fragments of violence. Fragments of fear. Fragments of a final encounter that no one had witnessed. The challenge for investigators was not simply determining what happened. It was determining who had done it. At first glance, there appeared to be few obvious clues. No eyewitness waiting nearby. No clear suspect. No immediate explanation. Only questions. The investigation moved forward carefully. Officers interviewed people connected to the victim. Friends. Family members. Co-workers. Anyone who might provide insight into her final days. They searched for disputes. Relationships. Conflicts. Anything that could explain why a young woman had suddenly lost her life. Yet as interviews continued, a troubling pattern emerged. Nothing stood out. No obvious enemy. No clear motive. No immediate answer. The case remained frustratingly open. Weeks later, investigators would face an even more disturbing reality. Because another woman would be found dead. And with that second discovery, the possibility of coincidence began to disappear. When Moriel Archambault failed to return to her normal routine, concern gradually replaced expectation. People who knew her understood something was wrong. Human beings create patterns in daily life. We arrive at work. We answer phones. We return calls. We keep appointments. When those patterns suddenly stop, loved ones notice. Eventually, the search for answers led to her apartment. What investigators encountered there was unsettling for reasons that extended beyond the crime itself. The apartment did not appear chaotic. There was no sign of a violent break-in. No shattered doorway. No dramatic indication that a stranger had forced his way inside. Instead, the scene suggested something else. Someone had been welcomed in. That possibility changed the direction of the investigation. A random attacker forcing entry was one thing. A killer who could gain trust was another. Detectives began considering a frightening possibility. Perhaps the victim had known her attacker. Or perhaps she had believed she did. The distinction mattered. Because one possibility pointed toward personal relationships. The other pointed toward deception. As crime scene technicians processed the apartment, every object became significant. A glass on a table. A photograph. A piece of clothing. An item out of place. Investigators understood that answers often hide within ordinary details. One discovery briefly appeared promising. A crumpled photograph found within the apartment attracted attention. For a time, some investigators wondered whether it depicted a possible suspect. Perhaps someone connected to the crime. Perhaps someone the victim had known. The photograph generated discussion and speculation. Yet hopes quickly faded. Further examination revealed a painful truth. The image was not connected to the killer at all. It was a photograph of the victim's deceased father. What initially appeared to be a lead became another dead end. Another reminder that investigations often move backward before they move forward. As months passed, pressure continued to grow. 2 victims. 2 investigations. And still no suspect. Then came January of 1970. Another apartment. Another discovery. Another life abruptly ended. Jean Way was 24 years old. Like the women before her, she had a future waiting ahead. Like the women before her, she never had the opportunity to reach it. Her body was discovered by someone who cared about her. Those moments are among the most devastating in any criminal case. The person arriving expects an ordinary meeting. Perhaps a conversation. Perhaps concern about unanswered calls. Instead, they find a reality that changes their life forever. For investigators, the scene immediately felt familiar. Too familiar. The similarities could no longer be ignored. Patterns were beginning to emerge. The victims were different people. Different backgrounds. Different lives. Yet certain characteristics linked the cases together. The same disturbing questions surfaced again and again. How had the killer gained access? Why were there so few obvious clues? Who was capable of committing such crimes repeatedly without attracting attention? The crime scene examination revealed something investigators had not fully appreciated before. Evidence suggesting resistance. Evidence suggesting a struggle. Tiny details. Easy to overlook. Yet potentially important. In homicide investigations, small details often carry enormous significance. A fiber. A fingerprint. A trace left behind unintentionally. Criminals may control many aspects of a crime. They rarely control everything. The challenge lies in identifying which detail matters. And which detail does not. At that stage, investigators still lacked the complete picture. What they possessed instead was a growing collection of fragments. Each victim added another piece. Each scene contributed another clue. The problem was that the puzzle remained incomplete. Meanwhile, fear was spreading beyond police headquarters. News of the murders traveled through neighborhoods. Conversations changed. Parents worried. Young women became more cautious. Apartment doors were checked twice before bed. Friends paid closer attention to one another's whereabouts. The city sensed a threat even if it could not yet identify it. And then, unexpectedly, the murders appeared to stop. Months passed. Then more months. The silence created uncertainty. Had the killer died? Moved away? Been arrested for another crime? No one knew. Investigators continued working, but momentum faded. Without new crimes, new evidence became difficult to obtain. The trail cooled. Files remained open. Questions remained unanswered. The victims' families remained trapped between grief and uncertainty. Then, in May of 1971, hundreds of miles away in Calgary, the silence ended. Elizabeth and Porteous failed to appear for work. At first, the absence seemed unusual. Then concerning. Then alarming. People who knew her understood that missing work without explanation was not normal behavior. Concern eventually prompted action. Someone checked on her apartment. The discovery that followed would alter the entire investigation. Inside, investigators encountered the most significant crime scene connected to the case. Unlike some earlier scenes, indications of struggle were more apparent. The encounter between victim and attacker had not unfolded quietly. Evidence suggested resistance, conflict, desperation. The room itself became a witness. Objects displaced from their ordinary positions. Details that reflected the chaos of a confrontation. For the first time, investigators felt they might be closer to understanding the offender. Then came a discovery beneath the victim's body. A broken cufflink. Small. Easily overlooked. Yet immediately important. Crime scene investigators understood that physical evidence has value precisely because it cannot forget. Witnesses may misremember. Suspects may lie. Evidence remains. The cufflink represented possibility. Possibility that the offender had finally left something behind. Possibility that the investigation was approaching a turning point. At the same time, witness information began producing another lead. Several people mentioned a man known as Bill. A well-dressed man. Charming. Confident. Someone who had recently spent time with Elizabeth. The description sounded ordinary. Perhaps too ordinary. Yet ordinary details often become extraordinary when viewed through the lens of an investigation. For detectives, the pieces were finally beginning to move. Not enough to solve the case. Not yet. But enough to create direction. Enough to create hope. The discoveries made at Elizabeth Porteous's apartment would eventually become the foundation for everything that followed. The physical evidence. The witness statements. The emerging timeline. Together, they transformed a collection of unanswered murders into something investigators could finally pursue. For nearly 2 years, the killer had remained hidden behind charm, distance, and uncertainty. Now, for the first time, the mask was beginning to slip. And somewhere beyond the crime scene tape, beyond the police reports, beyond the growing stack of case files, a predator who believed he had escaped detection was moving steadily toward the mistake that would ultimately expose him. By the time investigators began laying the files side by side, the weight of the case had already settled over 2 cities. What initially appeared to be separate tragedies was beginning to resemble something far more disturbing. 3 young women in Montreal. 1 woman in Calgary. Different lives. Different routines. Different social circles. Yet the similarities refused to disappear. Detectives studying the files found themselves returning to the same pages again and again. The same questions. The same unanswered mysteries. The same feeling that somewhere within the evidence was a connection nobody had fully recognized. The problem was that recognizing a pattern and proving a pattern were 2 very different things. In modern investigations, detectives often rely on extensive databases, advanced communication systems, and sophisticated technology capable of comparing information across jurisdictions within minutes. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, things were different. Information moved slower. Records were physical. Communication depended heavily on people noticing connections and sharing them. A crucial detail could remain hidden simply because it existed inside a filing cabinet hundreds of miles away. That reality became one of the greatest challenges facing investigators. In Montreal, detectives had spent months attempting to understand the murders of Shirley Audette, Moriel Archambault, and Jean Way. Each victim appeared to have encountered someone who gained access to her life through trust rather than force. The crime scenes suggested planning, control, confidence. The offender seemed comfortable operating within private spaces. That observation alone separated the crimes from many conventional homicide investigations. A person who commits murder during an argument often leaves chaos behind. Emotion overwhelms planning. Mistakes multiply. But the individual responsible for these crimes appeared calm, disciplined, methodical. The absence of obvious evidence became evidence itself. Investigators began constructing psychological theories. Perhaps the offender possessed experience. Perhaps he had committed crimes before. Perhaps he understood investigative procedures better than expected. Theories emerged during long meetings inside police offices where detectives gathered around tables covered in reports and photographs. Coffee cups accumulated. Cigarette smoke drifted toward ceilings. Hours became days. Days became weeks. Everyone searched for the missing piece. At first, attention focused heavily on people connected directly to the victims. Former boyfriends. Current romantic interests. Co-workers. Neighbors. Anyone whose name appeared repeatedly. The logic was straightforward. In many homicide investigations, the victim knows the offender. Statistically, it remains one of the strongest starting points. So investigators followed the evidence wherever it led. Interviews were conducted. Alibis were checked. Timelines were reconstructed. Names were crossed off lists, then replaced by new names. Again and again. Yet every promising lead eventually collapsed. One suspect had been out of town. Another possessed a verified alibi. Another simply had no meaningful connection to the crime. The investigation advanced a few steps and then stalled. Advanced again. Then stalled once more. Families waited for answers. Police departments faced growing pressure. The public wanted reassurance. The media wanted progress. Neither could be provided. As the months passed, another possibility began gaining attention. What if investigators were not looking for someone closely connected to the victims? What if the offender's greatest strength was precisely the opposite? What if he moved through their lives briefly, leaving almost no trace behind? That theory changed the nature of the investigation. Instead of examining long-term relationships, detectives began searching for short-term encounters. Chance meetings. Recent acquaintances. People remembered only vaguely. Unfortunately, human memory is imperfect. Witnesses struggle to recall ordinary conversations. Faces blur together. Details fade. Especially when nobody realizes a crime is about to occur. Many witnesses could remember fragments. A smile. A first name. A vehicle. A brief interaction. But fragments rarely solve cases by themselves. One name surfaced repeatedly. Bill. The problem was that Bill was one of the most common names imaginable. Finding a specific individual using only that information felt almost impossible. Investigators pursued dozens of possibilities. None produced results. Meanwhile, public concern continued growing. Rumors spread throughout neighborhoods. Speculation filled conversations. Some believed multiple offenders were responsible. Others suspected organized criminal activity. A few wondered whether the murders were completely unrelated. The lack of answers created space for imagination. And imagination often thrives where facts are absent. Inside police departments, frustration mounted. Detectives knew a dangerous offender remained free. Yet knowing that and proving who he was remained separated by an enormous gulf. Then came another complication. The murders stopped. At least temporarily. No new victims appeared. No fresh crime scenes emerged. No new evidence entered the investigation. For many detectives, the silence proved almost as frustrating as the crimes themselves. An active offender creates opportunities to make mistakes. An inactive offender disappears into the background. Months stretched into more than a year. Some investigators feared the trail had gone cold forever. Unknown to them, the offender had not vanished. He had simply changed locations. Wayne Bowden had left Montreal and relocated to Calgary. That move would unknowingly delay the investigation while simultaneously creating the circumstances that would ultimately expose him. When Elizabeth Ann Porteous was killed in May of 1971, Detectives in Calgary initially approached the case as a local investigation. They had no reason to believe they were stepping into a mystery stretching back years. Yet certain details immediately attracted attention. Witnesses described a man known as Bill, a well-dressed individual who appeared confident and charming, someone recently associated with the victim. For experienced investigators, the description stood out. Not because it identified a suspect, but because it matched a behavioral pattern increasingly familiar within the case. Trust, charm, access. The same ingredients appeared once again. Detectives began tracing the victim's recent interactions. Every conversation mattered. Every date mattered. Every acquaintance mattered. The process required patience. Investigations are often portrayed as dramatic bursts of inspiration. Reality is usually slower. A detective spends hours reviewing notes, conducting interviews, comparing statements, searching for inconsistencies. Most leads lead nowhere, yet each one must be examined. Because the lead that appears insignificant today may become critical tomorrow. Witnesses gradually helped establish a clearer picture. Several individuals remembered seeing Elizabeth with a stylish man. A man who appeared comfortable in social situations. A man associated with a distinctive vehicle. That information narrowed the field. Not enough to identify a killer, but enough to create direction. Then investigators encountered another obstacle. Even when a suspect emerges, suspicion alone means very little. Courts require evidence. Evidence requires work. And work requires time. Detectives began assembling timelines. Where had this man been? Who knew him? What could be verified? What remained speculation? The deeper they looked, the more intriguing the picture became. Yet questions still outnumbered answers. Some investigators believed they were finally close. Others remained cautious. Experience had taught them how easily investigations could drift toward the wrong conclusion. Confirmation bias represented a constant danger. Once detectives begin focusing on a suspect, every fact can appear to support that theory. Good investigators fight that instinct. They challenge their own assumptions. They test alternative explanations. They search for reasons they might be wrong. That discipline became essential in the Bowden investigation. Because the case contained numerous uncertainties. Witness recollections varied. Timelines remained incomplete. Physical evidence required interpretation. Nothing about the investigation was simple. Then there was the issue of appearance. Wayne Bowden did not resemble the public image of a violent offender. This mattered more than many people realize. Human beings naturally compare behavior to expectations. When someone looks threatening, suspicion comes easily. When someone appears polished and friendly, suspicion often arrives more slowly. Several people who encountered Bowden described him positively. That reality complicated the investigation. How could a man perceived as charming become connected to such horrific crimes? The question lingered over every discussion, every interview, every strategy meeting. Yet experienced detectives understood an uncomfortable truth. Appearance reveals very little about capability. History contains countless examples of offenders who hid behind respectability. Some wore uniforms. Some held professional careers. Some cultivated reputations for kindness. The mask varies. The deception remains the same. As investigators moved closer to identifying Bowden as a serious suspect, they still faced a critical problem. They needed something stronger than intuition. Stronger than witness descriptions. Stronger than coincidence. They needed evidence capable of surviving scrutiny inside a courtroom. Without that evidence, the investigation risked becoming another unsolved case. Another file gathering dust. Another collection of unanswered questions. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived, would emerge from a place few people expected. Not from a dramatic confession. Not from a hidden witness suddenly coming forward. Not from an anonymous tip. Instead, It would emerge from something the killer himself had left behind. Something investigators had been looking at for years without fully understanding its significance. A detail present across multiple crime scenes. A detail that seemed unusual from the beginning. A detail that would eventually connect a suspect to victims in a way criminal investigators had rarely attempted before. For years, detectives had searched for the man behind the smile. Now, for the first time, they were about to discover that the answer had been waiting within the evidence all along. The challenge was no longer finding a suspect. The challenge was proving it. And that proof would change the course of the entire investigation. For nearly 2 years, the investigation had existed in a state of frustration. Detectives possessed victims. They possessed crime scenes. They possessed witness statements, theories, timelines, and boxes filled with reports. What they did not possess was certainty. The killer remained a shadow moving between pieces of evidence. Visible only in fragments. Never fully revealed. Every investigator involved in the case understood the stakes. A predator had already taken multiple lives. The longer he remained unidentified, the greater the possibility that he would strike again. The pressure was immense. Yet pressure alone does not solve crimes. Evidence does. And in this case, the breakthrough would emerge from evidence that many people initially considered unusual. Perhaps even experimental. The turning point began after the murder of Elizabeth and Porteous in Calgary. Unlike previous investigations, detectives now possessed something valuable. Direction. Witnesses had provided information about a man known as Bill. A man who had recently spent time with the victim. A man associated with a distinctive vehicle. Investigators followed those leads carefully. What they discovered brought them closer to a suspect than they had ever been before. The vehicle was located. Its owner identified. His name was Wayne Clifford Bowden. For the first time, investigators were no longer pursuing an abstract figure. The mysterious Bill now had a face. A history. An address. A real identity. Detectives immediately began examining him more closely. On the surface, he did not fit the image many people imagined when they thought about violent offenders. He was presentable. Confident. Well-spoken. The kind of individual capable of making positive first impressions. Yet experienced investigators knew better than to trust appearances. Criminal investigations are filled with offenders who looked nothing like the monsters they became in private. When questioned, Bowden acknowledged knowing Elizabeth Porteous. He admitted they had been involved with one another. That admission mattered. It placed him directly inside the investigation. At the same time, he denied any responsibility for her death. The denial was expected. Very few offenders simply confess when first confronted. Especially offenders who believe they can outsmart investigators. So detectives continued building their case. Piece by piece. Fact by fact. The process was painstaking. Witnesses were interviewed again. Timelines were reconstructed with greater precision. Every movement was examined. Every statement compared. Investigators searched for inconsistencies. Small contradictions. Moments where the story no longer aligned with reality. Yet the most important development was taking place elsewhere. Inside laboratories. Inside examination rooms. Inside the minds of specialists searching for answers hidden within the physical evidence. 4 years, one detail had appeared repeatedly throughout the investigation. It was present in multiple cases. Present across different victims. Present despite changes in location and circumstance. The detail was unusual. Disturbing. And impossible to ignore. Marks left on the victims. Investigators had documented them carefully from the very beginning. Photographs had been taken. Measurements recorded. Observations preserved. The marks appeared intentional. Not accidental. Not random. They represented behavior. And behavior often reveals more about an offender than the offender realizes. The challenge was determining whether those marks could become evidence. At the time, forensic science was undergoing a period of transformation. Many techniques familiar today were either unavailable or still developing. DNA analysis did not exist as a practical investigative tool. Computers played only a limited role in criminal investigations. Detectives relied heavily on physical evidence, witness testimony, and specialist interpretation. One of those specialists was orthodontist Gordon Swan. When investigators approached him, they were entering territory few people had explored before. The idea itself sounded almost improbable. Could marks left by human teeth be compared to a suspect's dental structure? Could a person's bite function like a fingerprint? Could something so ordinary become the key to solving multiple murders? Those questions carried enormous significance. If the answer was yes, investigators might finally possess the evidence they desperately needed. If the answer was no, years of uncertainty would continue. Swan approached the challenge methodically. He understood the responsibility involved. A criminal investigation is not a place for assumptions. Conclusions require evidence. Evidence requires science. And science requires discipline. The first obstacle appeared immediately. Very little information existed. Bite mark comparison remained largely unexplored. There were few established procedures. Few precedents. Few examples capable of guiding the work. Rather than abandon the effort, Swan searched for additional resources. Information was gathered. Research was reviewed. Techniques were studied. Gradually, a framework began to emerge. Then came the comparisons. Investigators obtained dental impressions from Wayne Bowden. The process transformed a theory into a test. No longer were detectives asking whether the marks looked similar. Now they were asking whether measurable characteristics aligned. The distinction was critical. Scientific evidence depends on objective comparison. Not intuition. Not guesswork. Comparison after comparison was conducted. Measurements were examined. Patterns reviewed. Characteristics analyzed. As the work continued, a remarkable picture began taking shape. The similarities were extensive. Far beyond coincidence. Far beyond what investigators expected to find. According to the analysis, numerous matching characteristics existed between Bowden's dental structure and the marks documented on the victim. The implications were enormous. For the first time, detectives possessed evidence connecting a suspect to behavior observed across the crime scenes. The development changed everything. Within investigative circles, optimism began replacing uncertainty. The suspect who once existed merely as a possibility was becoming something more substantial. The evidence was beginning to point in a clear direction. Yet investigators remained cautious. Good detectives understand that breakthroughs can create their own dangers. Excitement can lead to overconfidence. Overconfidence can create mistakes. The goal was not merely to identify a suspect. The goal was to build a case capable of surviving scrutiny in court. Every finding would eventually face challenges. Questions. Counterarguments. Expert review. Therefore, every conclusion required careful support. As additional evidence was assembled, the larger picture became increasingly difficult to ignore. Witness statements. The relationship with Elizabeth Porteous. The vehicle. The physical evidence. The emerging forensic findings. Each piece reinforced the others. Individually, some elements might have appeared insufficient. Together, they formed a compelling narrative. The investigation that once seemed trapped in uncertainty was finally moving toward resolution. For detectives who had spent years pursuing answers, the moment carried profound significance. Cases like this leave marks on investigators. Photographs remain in memory. Victims remain in memory. Unanswered questions remain in memory. The possibility of finally obtaining justice creates a mixture of relief and determination. Relief because progress has finally arrived. Determination because the work is not yet finished. The breakthrough represented neither the end of the investigation nor the end of the story. It represented the transition from hunting a suspect to proving his guilt. An equally important challenge. Perhaps even a greater one. Because evidence does not speak for itself. Evidence must be presented, explained, defended, and ultimately judged. Yet before any courtroom proceedings could begin, investigators allowed themselves a rare moment of recognition. The man who had hidden behind charm and false identities for years was no longer invisible. The predator who had moved between cities believing he could remain anonymous had finally left behind something he could not control. A trace. A signature. A connection. Not through arrogance alone, but through repetition. The same behavior repeated often enough to become recognizable. That pattern became his undoing. The irony was impossible to ignore. The very acts that made the crimes distinctive had also made them traceable. What the offender believed separated him from everyone else ultimately separated him from his freedom. The investigation had crossed a threshold. For years, detectives had been asking who. Now they were beginning to answer it. The remaining question was whether the justice system would agree. That answer awaited inside a courtroom. And the battle that followed would determine whether one of the most significant criminal investigations in Canadian history achieved the outcome investigators had spent years pursuing. The arrest of a suspect is often portrayed as the ending of a criminal investigation. In reality, it is usually the beginning of an entirely different battle. For years, investigators had searched for answers. Now they needed something more difficult. They needed proof. Not proof that satisfied detectives. Not proof that satisfied public opinion. Proof that could survive inside a courtroom. Proof that could withstand scrutiny, challenge, and doubt. Because in every criminal trial, there are two stories competing for belief. The prosecution's story. And the defense's story. The courtroom becomes the place where those narratives collide. By the time Wayne Clifford Bowden entered that arena, the case surrounding him had already attracted enormous attention. The investigation had stretched across provinces. Multiple victims had been linked through a pattern of behavior. Witnesses had identified connections. Physical evidence had emerged. And perhaps most significantly, forensic specialists believed they had discovered something unprecedented. Yet none of that guaranteed a conviction. The justice system demands more than suspicion. It demands certainty beyond a reasonable doubt. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere reflected the gravity of what was at stake. Families carried years of grief into those proceedings. Investigators carried years of work. Prosecutors carried the burden of proving their case. And sitting at the center of everything was a man who had spent years avoiding accountability. For the families of the victims, simply seeing the process unfold carried emotional weight difficult to describe. A criminal case exists on paper. Reports. Photographs. Statements. Evidence files. But behind every document stands a human life. A daughter. A friend. A sister. Someone whose absence continued to shape the lives of people left behind. The courtroom forced everyone to confront that reality. The proceedings began with the careful presentation of evidence. Witnesses described timelines. Investigators explained discoveries. Experts walked jurors through findings that had emerged during the investigation. Each piece mattered. Each detail served a purpose. The prosecution's objective was not simply to tell a story. It was to construct a chain. A chain so strong that every link reinforced the next. One of the most significant aspects of the case involved forensic analysis. The examination of bite marks represented a relatively new concept within criminal investigations. That novelty immediately made it important and controversial. Whenever a legal proceeding introduces emerging science, questions follow. How reliable is the method? How widely accepted is it? Can its conclusions be trusted? These questions became central to the courtroom battle. Specialists explained how comparisons had been conducted, how characteristics had been examined, how similarities had been identified. The goal was to transform technical findings into information understandable to ordinary people. Jurors did not need to become scientists. They needed to understand why the evidence mattered, and why experts believed it connected the suspect to the crimes. The testimony demanded patience. Complex concepts rarely produce dramatic moments. Instead, they build gradually. Fact upon fact. Observation upon observation. Until a larger picture begins to emerge. For prosecutors, the bite mark evidence represented something powerful. Not because it existed alone, but because it existed alongside everything else. The relationship between Bowden and Elizabeth Porteous. Witness observations. The timeline of events. The physical evidence recovered during the investigation. Together, these elements reinforced one another. The prosecution repeatedly emphasized that no single piece stood in isolation. Each component strengthened the overall case. Meanwhile, the defense faced a difficult challenge. Their task was not necessarily to prove innocence. Their task was to create doubt, to identify weaknesses, to question assumptions, to challenge interpretations. That process lies at the heart of the adversarial system. Every significant piece of evidence becomes subject to examination. Every conclusion faces questions. Every witness encounters scrutiny. The courtroom became a place where certainty and uncertainty fought for dominance. As testimony continued, jurors were exposed to the full scope of the investigation. What had once existed as disconnected events gradually transformed into a coherent sequence. The similarities among the cases became harder to ignore. Patterns emerged. Behavioral consistencies emerged. Connections emerged. The narrative investigators had spent years constructing finally entered public view. For detectives sitting inside the courtroom, the experience carried unique significance. Investigations often unfold in fragments. One detective interviews witnesses. Another reviews evidence. Another examines timelines. No single person experiences every aspect simultaneously. The trial brought those pieces together. It revealed how years of work connected into a single picture. For many investigators, it also represented validation. Long hours. Missed weekends. Sleepless nights. The emotional burden of unsolved murders. All of it had led to this moment. Yet despite the importance of forensic evidence, the case ultimately rested on something broader. Human behavior. Again and again, witnesses described a man capable of gaining trust. A man who appeared harmless. A man who moved comfortably through social situations. Those descriptions aligned with the behavioral profile investigators had developed over time. The image emerging inside the courtroom differed sharply from the public stereotype of a violent offender. That contrast became one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. Predators do not always appear threatening. Sometimes they appear ordinary. Sometimes they appear successful. Sometimes they appear charming. The Wayne Bowden case forced jurors to confront that uncomfortable reality. As proceedings continued, the cumulative weight of the evidence became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The prosecution had not built its case around a single dramatic revelation. Instead, it relied upon accumulation. Each fact supporting another. Each witness strengthening the next. Each finding narrowing the space available for alternative explanations. Eventually, the trial reached the moment everyone had anticipated. Deliberation. The point at which evidence leaves the hands of lawyers and enters the hands of jurors. The courtroom grew quieter. Arguments had been made. Testimony had been heard. Now the decision belonged to others. For families waiting for answers, those hours felt longer than they truly were. Uncertainty possesses a unique ability to distort time. Minutes become hours. Hours become days. People replay testimony in their minds. Revisit evidence. Search for clues in expressions and body language. Yet ultimately, none of those observations matter. Only the verdict matters. When the decision finally arrived, years of uncertainty began drawing toward a conclusion. Wayne Bowden was convicted in connection with the murder of Elizabeth and Porteous. The verdict represented far more than the outcome of a single case. It represented recognition. Recognition that a dangerous offender had finally been identified. Recognition that years of investigative work had produced results. Recognition that a family would receive at least some measure of justice. Yet the story did not end there. Following the conviction, authorities continued examining Bowden's connection to the murders in Montreal. The evidence already assembled placed enormous pressure on him. The walls that had protected him for years were closing in. The image he had carefully maintained no longer carried the same power. The investigation had transformed him from an unknown predator into a convicted killer. As proceedings expanded, additional admissions followed. The names of Shirley Audette, Moriel Archambault, and Jean Way returned to the forefront. Women whose cases had haunted investigators for years. Women whose families had lived with unanswered questions. The acknowledgement of responsibility did not erase their loss. Nothing could. Justice cannot restore stolen futures. It cannot return daughters to parents. It cannot return friends to those who loved them. What it can do is establish truth. And truth matters. Even when it arrives late. Even when it arrives imperfectly. The legal consequences reflected the seriousness of the crimes. Multiple life sentences ensured that Wayne Bowden would spend the vast majority of his remaining years behind bars. The outcome represented society's strongest available response. Not revenge. Accountability. There is an important distinction between the two. One seeks suffering. The other seeks responsibility. The courtroom had completed its role. Evidence had been presented. Arguments heard. Judgment delivered. Yet the significance of the case extended beyond a single verdict. Legal experts, investigators, forensic specialists, all recognized that something unusual had occurred. The case had demonstrated new possibilities within criminal investigation. It had shown how unconventional evidence might contribute to solving violent crimes. It had revealed the importance of persistence. Most importantly, it had shown that even offenders who appear untouchable can leave traces behind. For years, Wayne Bowden believed he controlled the narrative. He selected victims. He created false identities. He relied upon charm. He relied upon deception. In the end, those strategies failed. Not because of one dramatic mistake, but because every crime leaves echoes. Every decision leaves traces. Every lie creates contradictions. Eventually, investigators gathered enough of those fragments to reveal the truth. The verdict marked the end of a legal process. But it also marked something else. The moment when a predator's freedom ended. And when the long journey toward justice finally reached its destination. Every true crime story eventually reaches a point where the courtroom doors close. The verdict has been delivered. The headlines begin to fade. Reporters move on to other stories. Investigators return to new cases. The public slowly redirects its attention elsewhere. From a distance, it can appear as though the story is over. But for the people most affected, the story rarely ends there. Because justice and healing are not the same thing. A conviction can answer questions. It cannot erase memories. It cannot restore stolen years. It cannot bring back the people whose lives were taken. Long after the legal proceedings concluded, the impact of the Wayne Bowden case continued to ripple outward. Some consequences were visible. Others remained hidden inside the lives of those left behind. For the families of the victims, the passage of time created a unique challenge. The world moved forward. Birthdays arrived. Holidays returned. Families gathered around dinner tables. Yet there was always an empty place where someone should have been. An absence that never fully disappeared. People often imagine grief as a process with a destination. Something that eventually reaches completion. Reality is rarely that simple. Loss changes shape over time. The sharp pain of the beginning gradually softens. But it never entirely vanishes. It becomes part of a person's landscape, part of the way they understand the world. For the loved ones of Shirley Audette, Moriel Archambault, Jean Way, and Elizabeth and Porteous, the names that appeared in newspaper articles represented far more than victims in a criminal investigation. They represented laughter remembered years later, family photographs stored in albums, conversations that ended too soon, dreams interrupted before they could become reality. Those are the things crime statistics never capture. The human dimensions hidden behind official records. As years passed, another legacy of the case began attracting attention. Not because of the crimes themselves, but because of the investigation that followed. The Wayne Bowden case became part of forensic history. Students entering law enforcement programs studied it. Investigators discussed it. Legal scholars examined it. The reason was simple. The case represented a significant moment in the evolution of forensic science. Before this investigation, many techniques that later became familiar were still developing. The scientific tools available to detectives remained limited compared to modern standards. Yet necessity often drives innovation. Investigators searching for answers explored methods that had rarely been tested in major criminal prosecutions. As a result, the case earned a place within discussions about forensic odontology and the use of dental evidence in criminal investigations. For a time, many viewed the case as a powerful example of science assisting justice. A demonstration that careful analysis could reveal connections invisible to the naked eye. The conclusion seemed encouraging. A dangerous offender had been identified. An investigation had succeeded. Evidence had helped establish accountability. Yet history rarely remains static. As forensic science continued evolving through the decades, researchers began revisiting older assumptions. Methods once considered groundbreaking became subjects of scrutiny. Questions emerged. Debates followed. Experts examined reliability. Standards changed. Expectations became more demanding. Among the techniques receiving renewed attention was bite mark analysis. Some researchers argued that the method possessed significant limitations. Others expressed concerns regarding consistency and accuracy. A number of wrongful conviction cases elsewhere intensified those discussions. The result was a complicated legacy. A technique once celebrated became increasingly controversial. For many observers, this created an interesting question. What should society think about cases like Wayne Bowden's in light of later debates? The answer is not entirely straightforward. While bite mark evidence played an important role in the investigation, it did not exist in isolation. Witness statements existed. Physical evidence existed. Behavioral patterns existed. The relationship with the final victim existed. Multiple elements combined to form the larger picture. The case therefore occupies a unique position in criminal justice history. It serves simultaneously as a landmark and as a reminder. A landmark demonstrating the desire of investigators to pursue new methods. A reminder that science must always continue questioning itself. Perhaps that lesson extends beyond forensic evidence. Perhaps it reflects something larger about human understanding. Every generation believes it possesses certainty. Then new information arrives. New technologies emerge. New discoveries challenge old conclusions. Progress often depends upon the willingness to re-examine what we think we know. The Wayne Bowden case illustrates that reality in a particularly striking way. Yet beyond the forensic discussions, another lesson remains equally important. A lesson about appearances. Many of the most notorious offenders in history shared a common characteristic. They looked ordinary. Not all predators hide behind threatening faces. Not all dangers announce themselves clearly. Some offenders understand social expectations. They understand trust. They understand presentation. They understand how quickly people form impressions. Wayne Bowden benefited from those assumptions for years. Witnesses frequently described him as charming, confident, well-dressed, approachable. Those qualities helped create opportunities. Opportunities that eventually resulted in tragedy. The uncomfortable truth revealed by cases like this is that evil often appears ordinary. Not because ordinary people are dangerous, but because dangerous people frequently learn how to appear ordinary. Recognizing that reality requires balance. It does not mean living in constant fear. It does not mean viewing everyone with suspicion. It means understanding that character cannot be measured solely by appearance. One of the enduring strengths of successful investigations is the refusal to rely upon assumptions. Investigators learn to examine evidence rather than stereotypes, facts rather than appearances, patterns rather than first impressions. That discipline played an essential role in this case. Without it, the outcome may have been very different. Years after his conviction, Wayne Bowden remained incarcerated. The freedom he once used to move between cities and cultivate false identities no longer existed. The man who had once controlled encounters now lived within a system that controlled him. The contrast was significant. For predators motivated by power and manipulation, the loss of control often represents a profound consequence. Time continued moving forward. Decades passed. The world changed. Technology transformed society. New generations emerged with little memory of the headlines that once dominated newspapers. Yet the case remained. Stored inside archives. Referenced in classrooms. Examined in books and documentaries. Not because of sensationalism alone. Because it represented a convergence of important themes. Violence. Investigation. Science. Justice. Human vulnerability. Human persistence. In March of 2006, Wayne Bowden died while still serving his sentence. His death closed the final chapter of his personal story. But it did not close the story of the case. Cases like this rarely disappear completely. Their influence survives in institutions, in policies, in investigative techniques, in the memories of those who lived through them. And perhaps most importantly, in the names of the victims themselves. True crime stories often risk becoming centered on offenders. The headlines focus on killers. The documentaries analyze motives. The public remembers nicknames. Over time, victims can become secondary characters within their own stories. That is a mistake. Because the true significance of these cases is not found in the people who committed the crimes. It is found in the lives interrupted by them. Shirley Audette, Moriel Archambault, Jean Way, Elizabeth and Porteous. 4 women with futures that extended far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. For lives that deserved to continue. For individuals whose stories became connected through tragedy. When we revisit cases like this, the most meaningful lesson is not how a killer operated. It is how communities responded. How investigators persisted. How families endured. How justice, imperfect though it may be, continued moving forward despite obstacles. The story of Wayne Bowden is ultimately not a story about a predator's success. It is a story about the limits of that success. Because no matter how carefully he concealed himself, the truth eventually emerged. No matter how effectively he manipulated trust, evidence remained. No matter how long uncertainty lasted, investigators continued searching. And in the end, the thing that survived was not the illusion he created. It was the reality uncovered after years of determination. Perhaps that is why these stories continue to matter. Not because they celebrate darkness, but because they reveal what is required to confront it. Patience, persistence, courage, and an unwavering commitment to finding the truth, even when the truth appears hidden. The victims deserved that commitment. Their families deserved that commitment. And the investigators who refused to abandon the search ultimately delivered it. The headlines faded. The courtroom emptied. The years passed. Yet the lessons remained. A reminder that appearances can deceive. A reminder that science continues evolving. A reminder that justice is often slow. And a reminder that behind every case file lies a human life worthy of being remembered. Long after the investigation ended, that remains the most important part of the story. Years have a way of changing everything. Cities change. Buildings disappear. New generations walk streets without knowing what happened there decades earlier. The people who once filled newspaper headlines become names buried inside archives. The urgency fades. The fear fades. The public memory fades. Time moves forward whether we are ready for it or not. And yet, some stories refuse to disappear completely. Not because of the crimes themselves. Not because of the notoriety of the offender. But because they reveal something enduring about human nature. The case of Wayne Bowden is one of those stories. Today, if someone walks through the neighborhoods connected to this investigation, they will not see the fear that once existed there. They will see ordinary life. People carrying groceries. Students walking home. Teachers preparing lessons. Friends meeting for coffee. The same ordinary moments that existed before the crimes ever occurred. The same ordinary moments that continued afterward. That contrast is important. Because true crime is often misunderstood. People sometimes imagine that a criminal case becomes the defining feature of a community forever. In reality, communities survive. They adapt. They heal. They continue. Life has a remarkable ability to move forward even after tremendous loss. But moving forward does not mean forgetting. The people closest to these events never truly forget. Investigators carry memories. Family members carry memories. Friends carry memories. Those memories become part of who they are. In interviews given by homicide investigators throughout history, many have described a similar experience. They remember faces. Not every face. Not every case. But certain victims remain with them. Years later. Sometimes decades later. Not because the cases were famous. Not because the investigations were difficult. But because every now and then, a case reminds investigators why their work matters. Behind every report is a human being. Behind every file number is a life. The Wayne Bowden investigation became one of those cases. It demonstrated what persistence can accomplish. The crimes crossed jurisdictions. The evidence was incomplete. The investigative tools available at the time were limited compared to modern standards. And yet investigators continued. They reviewed evidence repeatedly. They followed leads. They challenged assumptions. Most importantly, they refused to accept uncertainty as a permanent answer. That determination ultimately changed the outcome. There is another reason this case continues to attract attention. It forces people to confront an uncomfortable reality. The reality that danger does not always announce itself. Human beings instinctively categorize the world. Safe. Unsafe. Trustworthy. Suspicious. Friend. Stranger. These categories help us navigate daily life. Without them, ordinary social interaction would become impossible. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that appearances can be misleading. The lesson is not to fear everyone. The lesson is not to live in constant suspicion. The lesson is humility. Understanding that first impressions are not infallible. Understanding that confidence is not character. Understanding that charm is not integrity. Those distinctions matter. They mattered then. They matter now. Perhaps that is one reason cases involving deception leave such lasting impressions. The public often expects violence to look frightening. When it does not, people feel unsettled. The contrast between appearance and reality creates a deeper sense of vulnerability. Because if danger can wear a smile, then certainty becomes harder to find. That discomfort has followed this case for decades. Yet there is another side to the story. A more hopeful side. The story of people who refused to stop searching. The story of professionals who continued pursuing answers despite setbacks. The story of a justice system attempting to fulfill its purpose. No investigation is perfect. No system is perfect. Every generation inherits limitations from the one before it. What matters is the willingness to keep improving. The willingness to learn. The willingness to ask difficult questions. In many ways, that is exactly what happened after this case. Investigative methods evolved. Forensic science evolved. Standards evolved. Techniques once considered revolutionary became subjects of further examination. New technologies emerged. New discoveries reshaped old assumptions. That process continues today. And it should. Science is strongest when it remains open to scrutiny. Justice is strongest when it remains committed to truth. The legacy of this case therefore exists on multiple levels. It exists within criminal history. It exists within forensic history. It exists within the memories of those directly affected. And it exists within the broader conversation about how societies respond to violence. When people hear stories like this, they often ask the same question. Why revisit these cases at all? Why look backward? Why spend time examining events that occurred decades ago? The answer is not fascination with darkness. At least, it should not be. The answer lies in understanding. Understanding victims. Understanding investigations. Understanding mistakes. Understanding progress. Every solved case contains lessons. Every unsolved case contains lessons too. The challenge is recognizing them. The challenge is remembering that true crime is ultimately about people. Not mysteries. Not headlines. People. The names at the center of this story deserve to be remembered for more than the circumstances of their deaths. They had lives before the investigation. Dreams before the headlines. Relationships before the case files. Like all victims, they were more than what happened to them. That truth can become lost when stories are told repeatedly over many years. The offender becomes famous. The victims become footnotes. A responsible retelling attempts to reverse that imbalance. Because the measure of a life is never the way it ended. The measure of a life is everything that came before. Everything that mattered. Everything that connected one person to another. And so, as this story reaches its conclusion, perhaps the most important thing to remember is not the name that appeared in newspaper headlines. It is the names that appeared in memorials. The people whose futures were interrupted. The families forced to continue without them. The investigators who spent years pursuing answers. The communities that endured uncertainty and fear before finding resolution. Those are the lasting elements. Those are the parts that remain long after the courtroom empties. Long after the documents are archived. Long after the headlines disappear. History often remembers crimes because they are shocking. But history remembers justice because it is necessary. And in the end, that may be the most meaningful lesson of all. Darkness exists. It always has. Yet throughout this story, there were also people searching for truth. People refusing to surrender to uncertainty. People determined to ensure that victims would not simply become forgotten names. That determination did not erase the tragedy. Nothing ever could. But it transformed the outcome. It transformed unanswered questions into answers. It transformed suspicion into accountability. And it transformed a series of terrifying crimes into a case that would ultimately help shape the future of criminal investigation. The years continued to pass. The world continued to change. But the lessons remained. The importance of vigilance. The importance of evidence. The importance of perseverance. And above all, the importance of remembering the human beings at the center of every story. Because when the headlines finally fade, that is what endures. Not the killer. Not the notoriety. Not the myth. The people. They are the reason the story is told. And they are the reason it should never be forgotten. There are cases that survive not because of how they end, but because of what they force us to rethink. The Wayne Bowden case belongs to that category. On the surface, it is a solved investigation, multiple victims, a convicted offender, a clear procedural arc from discovery to arrest to courtroom judgment. But beneath that procedural clarity lies something far more complex, something that continues to matter long after the files are closed. Because the real legacy of this case is not just what Wayne Bowden did. It is what investigators believed they were seeing. And what they were actually dealing with. To understand that gap, you have to step away from the headlines and into the mindset of the investigation itself. Not as a story already finished, but as a problem unfolding in real time. When the first murders occurred in Montreal, investigators were not thinking in terms of serial behavior. That framework simply did not sit naturally in the investigative culture of the time. Each scene was treated as its own closed universe, its own isolated tragedy with its own explanation waiting to be found. This is an important limitation to understand. Because modern audiences often assume that pattern recognition is automatic in policing. It is not. Patterns only exist when someone is able to see across distance, across time, and across jurisdictions that do not naturally communicate with each other. In this case, that distance mattered more than almost anything else. 3 victims in one city. A pause. Then another victim in another city. To an outside observer today, the connection feels obvious. But at the time, investigators were still anchored in a world where local explanations came first. That is not failure. It is structure. It is how investigations were designed to think. And within that structure, Wayne Bowden remained invisible longer than he should have. What makes this case psychologically interesting is not just the crimes, but the method of access. There is a category of offenders who do not rely on force as their primary tool. They rely on entry. Social entry. Emotional entry. Situational entry. The ability to be present in a space without triggering alarm. Bowden, based on investigative records and witness descriptions, fit into that category. He did not appear as an intrusion. He appeared as permission. That distinction changes everything. Because once a victim grants access willingly, even briefly, the entire structure of suspicion collapses at the moment of entry. There is no broken lock. No forced door. No obvious violation of physical boundaries that would immediately signal danger. Instead, there is ambiguity. And ambiguity is the enemy of fast resolution in criminal investigations. It slows interpretation. It introduces doubt. It fragments timelines. From a behavioral perspective, what investigators were actually confronting was not just a series of violent acts, but a repeatable social script. A repeated sequence of approach, trust building, private transition, and then violence. That sequence is far more difficult to detect than a stranger attack, because it hides inside normal human interaction. One of the most important lessons from this case is that the entry point into a crime is often more significant than the crime itself. Once investigators understood that, they stopped looking only at what happened inside the crime scenes and started asking a different question. How did he get there? That shift is where the investigation began to change. Another layer that often gets simplified in retellings is the forensic bite mark evidence. It is easy to frame it as a single decisive breakthrough, a dramatic scientific moment that solved everything. The reality is more complicated and more instructive. At the time, bite mark comparison was still an emerging discipline. It carried an aura of precision, because human intuition tends to assign high credibility to anything that looks anatomical, measurable, and visual. Teeth feel unique. Patterns feel individual. And when those patterns appear on skin, the instinct is to treat them like fingerprints. But the scientific reality was, and remains, more contested than that intuition suggests. In the Bowden case, bite mark analysis functioned as one component within a larger evidentiary ecosystem. It was not operating in isolation. It was being weighed alongside witness identification, behavioral linkage, victim association, and physical circumstantial evidence such as the vehicle connection and interpersonal relationships. This matters because one of the most persistent myths in true crime storytelling is the idea of a single breakthrough clue that solves everything instantly. Real investigations almost never work that way. They accumulate pressure, piece by piece, until the probability of innocence becomes harder to sustain than the probability of guilt. In Bowden's case, The bite mark evidence contributed to that accumulation. But it did not replace the investigative groundwork. It reinforced it. That distinction is critical for understanding both the strength and the later controversy surrounding similar forensic methods. Because when science is introduced into the courtroom, it does not only answer questions. It also creates precedent. And precedent has consequences beyond a single case. The Bowden case later became part of a broader conversation in forensic science about how much weight should be assigned to pattern-based identification methods. Not because the entire investigation was discredited, but because the field itself evolved. New standards emerged. New technologies appeared. DNA fundamentally changed the landscape. What was once considered persuasive became, in some contexts, insufficient on its own. That is not a failure of the investigators. It is a reflection of scientific evolution. Looking back, the most important takeaway is not whether every forensic conclusion was perfect. It is that investigators used every available tool to bridge a gap that otherwise would have remained open. And in the absence of modern technology, that matters more than hindsight criticism often acknowledges. There is also a psychological layer to this case that deserves attention. Offenders like Bowden challenge a deeply ingrained assumption in human judgment, that dangerous behavior correlates with visible danger. In other words, we expect threat to look like threat. This expectation is not irrational. It is efficient. Human beings rely on rapid categorization to navigate social environments safely. But efficiency comes at a cost. It creates blind spots. Bowden operated inside those blind spots. Not because people were careless, but because people were normal. He leveraged normal expectations about politeness, appearance, and social ease. That is what made his behavior difficult to detect in advance. Not invisibility, but familiarity. He did not need to deceive everyone all the time. He only needed to appear unremarkable at the right moments. From a modern behavioral analysis perspective, that is one of the most important insights the case offers. Danger does not always announce itself. It often integrates itself. And once integrated, it becomes harder to isolate without retrospective information. This is why cases like this continue to be studied in investigative training environments. Not because they are rare in outcome, but because they are instructive in mechanism. They show how fragmentation in information systems, combined with social trust and limited forensic tools, can delay recognition of patterns that only become visible in hindsight. They also show something else that is often overlooked. Persistence matters more than speed. This case did not resolve quickly. It resolved through accumulation, cross-referencing, and sustained investigative effort across time and jurisdictional boundaries. That is not cinematic. But it is real. And in real investigations, endurance is often the deciding factor. Finally, there is the human dimension that sits beneath all technical analysis. Every forensic method, every behavioral theory, every courtroom argument ultimately exists because of one underlying reality. There were victims whose lives were interrupted and families who had to continue without them. No investigative framework should ever separate itself from that fact. Because when it does, cases become abstract. And abstraction is where meaning begins to dissolve. The Wayne Bowden case, viewed in full, is not just a narrative of criminal behavior or forensic innovation. It is a reminder that justice is constructed slowly, imperfectly, and through systems that are always learning. It is a reminder that appearance is not identity. That trust can be manipulated. That evidence must be interpreted carefully. And that truth, when it finally emerges, is rarely simple. It is layered. It is built. And it is earned. Long after the case files were closed, what remains is not the profile of the offender, but the lesson of the process itself. That is what gives this case its lasting relevance. Not the darkness it contains, but the effort required to bring that darkness into view.